Yesterday, Arun Jaitley gave advice to the CAG, telling the institution not to sensationalize and not to point fingers. He told them restraint was as important as being active. Most people would say this is very different to how Mr. Jaitley responded when the former UPA government accused the CAG of exaggeration and sensationalization during 2G and Coalgate. So has Arun Jaitley done a U-turn? And secondly, is it right for a government minister to advise an independent constitutional authority? Or has Mr. Jaitley, perhaps unwittingly, overstepped the mark? My guests are former Law Minister Salman Khurshid, the editor of the Business Standard A.K. Bhattacharya, the editor of Mail Today Sandeep Bamzai, and BJP spokesperson Sambit Patra. Salman Khurshid, yesterday in an address to the CAG, Finance Minister Arun Jaitley said, and I'm quoting, he doesn't have to sensationalize, he doesn't have to get into the headlines. Now, in your eyes, is that sage advice? Or is it tantamount to hypocrisy? Because at the time when the CAG was sensationalizing, as you put it, Coalgate and 2G, Mr. Jaitley didn't seem to have these concerns.
Karan, I want to be fair to Mr. Jaitley. I think amongst the entire pack of BJP leaders, if someone was during that time a little bit of a sane voice, it was him. There were others who really were completely wild in their criticism of our government on issues which were really not fair. And I think that criticism by the opposition is understandable, but it has to be proportionate, it has to be reasonable, it has to be balanced. And certainly the atmosphere that prevailed at that time, everybody said they had a free-for-all, get onto television and then hang the dog, give it a bad name and hang the dog, etc. attitude. And I think that was really unfair, not just on us, but I believe on the country as well. So if some sense has now prevailed, so late, perhaps at great cost to us, it's still welcome. And I hope that this will hold good even when they are in opposition again.
So are you then in that answer saying to me you don't agree with Ajay Markan and Rashid Alvi, both of whom have accused Arun Jaitley of hypocrisy? Are you saying you differ from them?
See, no, I'm not disagreeing. There is, listen, not everybody in the Congress and not everybody in the BJP reads to a written script. All I am saying is that his colleagues were really completely unrestrained, but if anyone had a little bit of balance and reason, it was him.
Okay.
But quite often they didn't even listen to him. But the fact, of course, is that the general Congress party approach on what the BJP did to us, there is, I guess, no difference of opinion. The BJP was extremely unfair, and I've said not just to us, but to the country as well.
Mr. Bhattacharya, I take on board the distinction Salman Khurshid is making between the BJP as a whole and Arun Jaitley. But Mr. Jaitley, in fact, went one step further yesterday. He said auditors mustn't seek to convert public opinion into a lynch mob. Now, if I recall correctly, at the time of 2G and Coalgate, the CAG held press conferences to make public its findings. I readily accept that's not lynch mob treatment, but nonetheless, that is an attempt at orchestrating public opinion. And I don't recall anyone in the BJP, even Mr. Jaitley this time, objecting to the CAG holding press conferences. So is this a new position the BJP is taking in the shape and form of Mr. Jaitley's new attitude?
I think there is a bit of misunderstanding on the issues that are being raised here. If the CAG held a press conference on its reports on coal as well as on TG, they did so only after they were tabled in Parliament, and in my view it is within its rights to do so, because it is important for a constitutional authority, the Comptroller and Auditor General of India, to lay bare the facts that have been produced and presented to the nation in its reports. So there is nothing wrong per se, and if somebody is saying don't hold a press conference, I would certainly say that this is not proper, but I don't think this is what Mr. Jaitley has said.
No, he didn't. I didn't say he said it either. I was simply saying, I was actually saying that the criticism that the CAG shouldn't behave like a lynch mob was the criticism made by Mr. Jaitley, and I was equating it to the way press conferences were used to orchestrate public opinion. You clearly don't agree with that equation.
I don't agree with that at all. I think the CAG was doing a service to the nation by holding those press conferences, because these are technical reports, and it is important for the Constitutional Authority to explain the purpose and the rationale of those reports and the arguments it has explained.
Okay. Let me put it like this, Sandeep Bamzai. Mr. Jaitley has said that the CAG must not point fingers. He said that although the auditor has to be active, activism and restraint are two sides of the same coin. Now, when the CAG, as the Congress felt, was being activist over 2G and Colgate, when Congress claimed he was pointing fingers, Mr. Jaitley seemed to have no objections at that point of time. I'm coming back to that central concern. Is Congress therefore right in saying this is double standards? Or do you agree with Mr. Bhattacharya that Mr. Jaitley is not really responsible for that?
What is the Comptroller and Auditor General's role? His role is to track every rupee that is spent by the government and its affiliates. It is an adjunct of the Public Accounts Committee, which works to more or less do the same thing. What has happened in these two celebrated cases, both 2G and Colgate? 2G licenses were cancelled by the Supreme Court of India, all 122 of them. All 218 barring 4 coal blocks were cancelled by the Supreme Court of India. You can argue that there was a gap between subjectivity and objectivity as far as presumptive loss is concerned.
No, but I'm not talking about the details. You're missing the point. I'm asking a different question. I'm asking whether there is any basis for Mr. Jaitley today saying to the CAG, don't point fingers. Because people think the only time they pointed fingers was over 2G when he was silent.
No. How can... That's the point I'm making. How can the Comptroller and Auditor General keep quiet? His job, as I mentioned, by mandate, is to track the rupee.
Then it follows from what you're saying that Mr. Jaitley has no business to give them this advice, because they've never been pointing fingers.
Absolutely. He has no business to give them that advice, because I think, just as AKB just said, the CAG has done human service to the country.
So forget the CAG. I'm talking about Mr. Jaitley. You're saying to me that Mr. Jaitley had no business to say don't point fingers. He had no business to say don't sensationalize, because they've never pointed fingers. They've never sensationalized. Is that your position?
What did Vinod Rai do? He barely laid the facts of the two cases on the table of Parliament.
So your answer is yes to my question.
Of course.
Let me bring you in, Sambit Patra. You've got two different types of criticisms being made of Mr. Jaitley. Salman Khurshid, who's pointing out not Mr. Jaitley so much, but the BJP is being hypocritical when they turn around and tell the Auditor General don't sensationalize. They never said this earlier when they should have. And you've got Mr. Bhattacharya and you've got Sandeep Bamzai saying you have no business to give such advice. Such advice presumes the CAG has sensationalized. He never did. So Mr. Jaitley is now being criticized from both points of view.
No, Karan, I mean, in a smiling wit, I would say that, look, what we are doing today is what exactly Mr. Arun Jaitley advised not to do to the CAG. We are trying to sensationalize his single sentence and not seeing the whole speech of his in entirety. If we go to the whole speech of his in entirety, let me just read out 3 lines. I believe things would be extremely clear. If uncomfortable questions at times were not asked, says Mr. Jaitley, governance would tend to become despotic, and therefore, in any system of governance, there has to be various laws of accountability, and this is in itself an unquestionable proposition. So, Mr. Jaitley rightly says that, well, yes, there has to be a system of accountability, corruption has to stop. The procedure of investigation is what is more important than trying to grab the headlines. So, well, yes, we should see the whole thing in toto, what Mr. Jaitley said. He, in fact, has gone to the length of the issue as to how the procedures have to be carried out.
Yes, actually, forgive me, Sambit, you're also reading selectively. I'm going to equally read from Mr. Jaitley's speech, and that strengthens the reason why people are being critical from both standpoints. He says, he, meaning the Auditor General, must be conscious of the fact that he is reviewing a decision which has already been taken. The environment of finger pointing cannot be allowed to replace fair and reasonable decision making. I think it's a subtle distinction in your capacity building which has to emerge at this stage. That is certainly criticism of the CAG. Now I'm going to go back to Salman Khurshid. Salman Khurshid, even if this criticism is being made today in a different context, And even if your party feels Mr. Jaitley is hypocritical because he didn't say it earlier when 2G and Colgate were happening, nonetheless, do you welcome this advice? Or do you think government ministers have no basis for giving such advice to independent constitutional authorities?
Well, I think that this is sound advice, as if you take it standalone, bereft of the political connotations between two political parties in the opposition and in government. It's sound advice. I only wonder if one of us had given this advice at that time, what would have happened to us? They would have torn us apart, and perhaps you would have helped them tear us apart. But it's sound advice, and I think if this is an institutional approach to how we should run this country and this governance of this country, I think this is sensible. Nobody's saying to the CAG, please don't look at any aberrations or any defaults that may have taken place in governance, financial governance. All that's being said is, please put it in the report and give it to Parliament.
Okay.
Don't then start advocacy on your own. And I think that this is true. A President of India gets so many things coming from different political parties. Is the President of India going to hold press conferences and tell the world, I'll tell you what somebody said to me and I'll tell you what somebody said to me? I think the very idea of constitutional authorities getting in front of the media and telling the world how wonderful they are, I think that's completely unacceptable. Much as we respect constitutional authorities, and we must.
This is very interesting. Mr. Bhattacharya, I want to draw your attention to another apparent contrast between what Arun Jaitley is saying today and between what he said earlier when he was leader of the opposition. Today, he's telling the CAG how to behave, or more importantly, how not to behave, when he says don't sensationalize, don't point fingers, etc., etc., and there's quite a lot of it. But when he was leader of the opposition and Dr. Manmohan Singh was criticizing the CAG, Arun Jaitley turned around and said that that was unacceptable behavior from the Prime Minister, and that the Prime Minister had no business criticizing an independent constitutional authority. Is Arun Jaitley today guilty of doing the same thing that he accused Dr. Manmohan Singh of? And is he also guilty of some hypocrisy, or is that an unfair question?
Well, that's not an entirely unfair question. I think I disagree with Mr. Khurshid, with due respect to him, that no minister, in my view, should try to offer gratuitous advice to a constitutional authority on how he should behave. I think the constitutional authority, once appointed, very well knows his responsibilities, his brief, and what he ought to do and what he ought not to do. So any advice from any part of the executive is likely to be misunderstood. But as I said earlier, that taken in isolation, the advice that the CAG should not sensationalize matters is very valid. You have to first find out who is sensationalizing it. Is it the media, or is it the opposition political parties? Most probably what was happening last time was the opposition political parties were sensationalizing the CAG reports. But then, because the CAG report, as you know, the 2G report particularly, did not give the 1.76 lakh figure.
But then, Mr. Bhattacharya,
and they gave three sets of figures.
Can I interrupt? You're making another implicit criticism of Arun Jaitley when you say this, because what you're pointing out is that Arun Jaitley is telling the CAG don't sensationalize, but it wasn't the CAG that sensationalized, it was the press and perhaps the opposition, which is to say Arun Jaitley's party. So the advice he's given shouldn't be directed at the CAG, it should be directed at his fellow members in the BJP who did the sensationalizing. That's another implicit criticism of Jaitley, isn't it?
I mean, I think any political party should understand that a constitutional authority is not a plaything. These are important checks and balances in any democracy, and no such intervention or interference is warranted.
Let me put it like this. Sandeep Bamzai, the media, certainly the opposition parties, have both come to the conclusion that Arun Jaitley has done a U-turn. Number two, that Arun Jaitley may have crossed a Lakshman Rekha. Ministers have no right to give advice, leave aside, criticize institutions like the CAG. Is the media wrong? Is the opposition wrong in coming to that conclusion, or are they right?
No, I think body politics seems to be closing ranks against the interloper. The interloper in this case turns out to be CAG. What did the CAG say? CAG said that here are 3 valuation models and I am arriving at a presumptive loss of 176,000 crores. Which were the 3 valuation models? The Etisalat and Unitech deal?
But don't lose us in the details. The point I'm asking is this. In closing ranks against the CAG, what you're saying is that suddenly the interests of Congress and BJP are converging. The CAG is being attacked by both.
Well, it appears so from Mr. Jaitley's speech yesterday and the one that you're reading out and the one that we reported this morning. It appears so. But the reality is that the Comptroller and Auditor General is an auditor. The auditor places accounts. The accounts showed 3 models.
That I understand.
Those models arrived at a figure.
I understand.
And wait,
but the discussion is not about the auditor, it's about Jaitley.
1 minute. Those valuation models ultimately proved out to be right.
Yes, but we're not talking about the valuation model, we're talking about Jaitley. Are you therefore concluding, are you therefore concluding that Jaitley was mistaken both in giving advice as well as in the content of the advice?
The one yesterday?
Yes.
I would think, actually I'm quite surprised that he has said this to the Comptroller and Auditor General when the Comptroller and Auditor General is sitting beside him at a function organized by the Comptroller and Auditor General.
So this was out of place?
I think it was out of turn more than out of place. Okay. Why should he say this, given that we know what happened over the last 4 or 5 years with the BJP attacking the Congress on these very issues?
You know, that's the essential point, is it, Sampath Patra? On these very issues, the BJP attacked Congress for 4 or 5 years running. Now, on these very issues, Mr. Jaitley wishes to give advice to the CAG. That's precisely the point Sandeep Bamza is making. That's why people feel there is some hypocrisy or U-turn in Mr. Jaitley's position. Even if his advice is sage and well-intended, coming from him, it's A, unfortunate, and B, out of turn.
Karan, you have to understand one thing. We are making a basic mistake. The basic mistake is we are not trying to see the context under which the statement was given by Mr. Arun Jaitley and the statement against CAG was given by the then Prime Minister, Mr. Manmohan Singh. Mr. Arun Jaitley is in an interactive session, and as rightly pointed out by Sandeep, he is with the CAG in a function in where he is supposed to interact with the CAG, he is supposed to give his advice as a finance minister.
But he was actually making a speech.
No, that's what. It's an interactive session where he was making a speech and many other people would also have made a speech, including the Comptroller and Auditor General of India. And secondly, if...
I'm not sure how speeches become interactive, but I'll give you the benefit of that doubt.
I believe I deserve some time without interruption. And what I was saying was the context of criticism of CAG by the Prime Minister, Mr. Manmohan Singh, was quite different. It was after disclosures. It was after the disclosure of 2G and the Colgate.
And this is a warning across the knuckles before disclosure.
No. This is not at all a warning.
This is a warning in advance. Don't do it because we'll be very angry if you do.
This is a friendly interaction which has to be read in entirety. The whole speech has to be gone through. Only then we would realize that it is neither an advice, it is nor any kind of diktat on them. It is just an interaction in which the finance minister reads out.
I hear you. Just an interaction, but not advice. Very strange that you say it's not advice, because the rest of us thought it was just advice, not a diktat. But never mind. Salman Khurshid, to be honest, there must be hundreds of occasions when Congress ministers have said one thing in office, quite a different thing in opposition, and similarly embarrassed themselves. Is that not just the nature of switching from opposition to government, that you will end up finding things that you said in opposition being thrown back at your face when you're in government? Therefore, in a real sense, don't you sympathize with Mr. Jaitley's predicament?
Well, I think you're asking the wrong person. I said to you in the beginning that in the entire pack, if someone showed signs of reasonableness, it was him. And I must say that he's very different from the rest of the pack. Despite that, of course, his party expected him to do certain things, and he did. But certainly, if there were any communication levels that were intact in the upper house and with the opposition, then it was because of Mr. Jaitley. Okay. Having said that, I think people are just tying themselves into knots. Having taken one position, it's not just the political parties or people who've been ministers and in the opposition, but the media as well. Having said something at that time, they now find it very difficult to say something different. The fact remains that there is lack of objectivity in many of these discussions, and I think each one of us have to look within to find whether we've been objective or have we been carried away by our personal emotions.
That's a very fair point. Many politicians need to listen to it and take advice from you on that particular point. Mr. Bhattacharya, my last question, because we're running out of time. You've been much more understanding of Mr. Jaitley, much more critical of people being critical of Mr. Jaitley, if I can so put it. Is this one reason why today, as far as I can tell, this particular story wasn't in your paper? Your rivals, on the other hand, played it up quite considerably, and to criticism of Mr. Jaitley. Your paper hasn't really covered it at all, as far as I can tell. Is that why? Because you think it's a non-story?
Let me correct you, Mr. Thapar. You should read the paper once again. It is very much there in the paper. It is not just in one page. It is there in one page, and also there is as a big quote of Mr. Jaitley, which has been highlighted very well in the paper.
The quote I saw at the top of a page, but I never saw an article. I must have missed it. I never saw the article. I saw the quotation at the top, on the banner top.
I would like you to go over the paper once again.
Then I apologize to you on air, because I went through the paper two or three times looking for it before I made this point, because I was pretty certain it wasn't there and I couldn't find it. I apologize. But am I right in saying that you're more understanding of Mr. Jaitley and you're not critical of him in the way your rival papers have been?
Well, you know, I mean, no, the question is that if anybody is questioning a constitutional authority and giving a piece of advice of this nature, in isolation, you understand the point, because no institutional authority should be sensationalizing it. But I think coming from a former BJP leader, opposition leader particularly, this does seem out of place and out of turn.
All right, it does seem out of place and it does seem out of turn. We're going to leave it there. My thanks to all four of my guests, and once again, Mr. Bhattacharya, my apologies if I missed that piece, but I must tell you, I scanned the paper 2 or 3 times. Perhaps I'm growing old and my eyes are clearly failing me.